The summer sun painted golden streaks across the sky as Carlos Martinez stood in his new driveway, keys still warm in his hand. The two-story house before him represented everything he and his wife, Elena, had worked for over the past 20 years. Its red brick exterior and white trim reminded him of the home he dreamed about while serving overseas during those long nights when thoughts of his family kept him going. "Papi, look, my window is up there," his 12-year-old daughter Isabella called out, pointing to a second-floor window with excitement dancing in her eyes. His 15-year-old son Miguel was already exploring the garage, probably planning where to set up his basketball hoop. The Oak Grove neighborhood in Connecticut was picture-perfect, with its tree-lined streets and well-maintained lawns. It was the kind of place where people jogged early in the morning and children rode their bikes after school. The kind of place where Carlos and Elena hoped their kids could grow up safe and happy. Elena appeared beside him, sliding her hand into his. "Can you believe it's really ours?" she whispered, her voice carrying the same wonder he felt. 23 years ago, they'd started their journey in a tiny apartment, with Elena working double shifts at the hospital while Carlos was deployed. Now, here they stood in front of their dream home. The moving truck rumbled up the street, and soon their quiet moment of reflection transformed into a flurry of activity. Box after box made its way into the house, each containing pieces of their life story. Carlos directed traffic like he used to direct his units, with precision and care, but now with a smile he couldn't suppress. As they unpacked, Carlos's mind wandered to his plans for the backyard. It was bigger than any they'd had before, with a gentle slope that led to a small wooded area. The previous owners had left it bare, but Carlos saw its potential. He could already picture the stone patio he would build, the garden Elena had always wanted, and most importantly, the perfect spot for his grill. Family gatherings had always been the heart of their life. Even during his years in the Marine Corps, Carlos had made sure to maintain this tradition whenever he was home. The smell of grilled meat and the sound of laughter were his ways of creating memories that would last through the long deployments. Over the next few weeks, Carlos threw himself into transforming the backyard. Every morning before work, he'd spend an hour working on his project. The neighbors would see him out there, methodically laying stones for the patio, but few stopped to say hello. He noticed their curious glances, the way some would hurry past their fence, but he focused on his work instead. Elena worried about the cool reception. "Maybe we should go introduce ourselves," she suggested one evening, watching their neighbors through the kitchen window. But Carlos knew better. "Let them come to us, mi amor. The best way to change minds is to let them see who we really are." He worked tirelessly, his hands building not just a patio but a foundation for their future here. Miguel helped after school, learning to mix cement and level stones. Isabella planted flowers along the border, carefully selecting colors that would bloom in different seasons. Even Elena, despite her busy schedule at the local hospital where she'd recently started as a nurse, found time to help with the garden. The transformation was remarkable. What had been an empty yard became a welcoming space with a stone patio, flowering borders, and carefully placed lighting. The centerpiece was the built-in grill station Carlos had designed himself, remembering all the lessons his own father had taught him about the art of barbecue. As June rolled around, Carlos knew it was time. Their family tradition called for a big gathering at the start of summer, and he wasn't about to let their new location change that. Elena sent out invitations to their extended family and close friends from Carlos's unit. They planned everything carefully, the menu, the seating, even the parking arrangements to avoid disturbing their neighbors. The day before the BBQ, Carlos spent hours preparing the meat, using his father's secret marinade recipe. The same recipe that had been passed down through generations, the one that had made their gatherings famous among his Marine Corps colleagues. Elena baked her special tres leches cake, while Isabella and Miguel helped set up tables and chairs. That evening, as Carlos stood in his backyard looking at their work, he felt a deep sense of pride. This wasn't just about having a nice place to host parties. It was about creating a space where their family could grow, where their culture could flourish, and where they could share their traditions with their new community. Little did he know that their first family gathering in Oak Grove would become much more than just a BBQ. As he checked the weather forecast one last time before heading to bed, Carlos couldn't have predicted how the next day's events would not only challenge their place in this community, but also reveal truths that would leave their neighbors speechless. Isabella's voice drifted down from upstairs, singing one of her favorite songs while she helped her mother prepare the last of the side dishes. Miguel was in the garage, organizing the coolers for tomorrow. The house hummed with anticipation, the kind that comes before any big family event. Carlos took one last walk around the yard, checking that everything was perfect. The lights he'd installed cast a warm glow over the patio, and the evening breeze carried the scent of Elena's flowers. Tomorrow, this space would be filled with the sounds of family, the smell of grilling meat, and hopefully, the beginning of new friendships in their new community. As he headed inside, Carlos paused at the door, looking back at their creation. In the Marine Corps, he'd learned that the strongest units were built on mutual respect and understanding. Maybe, just maybe, this backyard would become a place where those same values could bridge the gaps between neighbors who saw them as different. Little did he know just how soon that theory would be tested. The morning of the BBQ arrived with perfect weather, sunny skies, and a gentle breeze that carried the promise of a beautiful day. Carlos was up before dawn, his military habits still strong even years after active duty. He moved quietly through the kitchen, careful not to wake his family as he began his preparations. By 9 o'clock, the backyard had transformed into a celebration space. Colorful tablecloths brightened the patio tables, and Elena's flower arrangements added cheerful splashes of color. The smell of Carlos's signature marinade already filled the air as he prepared the grill, humming an old Spanish song his father used to sing during their family cookouts. Isabella and Miguel had outdone themselves with the decorations. Paper lanterns hung from strings between the trees, ready to light up the evening. They'd even created a special playlist, mixing their parents' favorite old songs with current hits, a perfect blend of their family's past and present. The first guests arrived around noon. Elena's sister Rosa with her husband and 3 kids. Soon after, more family members and friends started flowing in, each bringing dishes that added to the already impressive spread. The backyard filled with the sounds of happy greetings, children playing, and music floating through the air. Carlos stood at his grill, expertly flipping marinated meats while chatting with his old friend Pete, who'd served with him in the Marines. The aroma of grilling chicken, beef, and his special chorizo filled the air, mingling with the scent of Elena's homemade tortillas warming on the side burner. That's when the first sign of trouble appeared. A sharp voice cut through the festive atmosphere like a knife. "Excuse me, excuse-me." The conversation near the grill quieted as everyone turned to look at the fence. There stood Karen Thompson, their next-door neighbor, her face pinched with what looked like practiced outrage. She wore designer yoga pants and a pastel polo shirt, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail that seemed to stretch her forehead. "This is completely unacceptable," she announced, her voice carrying across the yard. "The smell is overwhelming my entire house. I had to close all my windows." Carlos handed his tongs to Pete and walked calmly toward the fence, wiping his hands on his Kiss the Cook apron. A Father's Day gift from Isabella. "Good afternoon, neighbor," he said pleasantly. "Would you like to join us? We have plenty of food." Karen's face reddened. "Join you? I want you to stop this disruption immediately. This is a quiet neighborhood. We have standards here." By now, several guests had stopped their conversations to watch. Elena moved closer to Carlos, placing a gentle hand on his arm. The children, sensing the tension, gathered near their parents. "We're just having a family BBQ," Elena explained softly. "It's a beautiful day to be outside. Family BBQ." Karen scoffed, her eyes scanning the crowd. "This looks more like a block party. How many people are here? This has to be breaking some kind of ordinance. And that music, it's not appropriate for this neighborhood." Miguel, who had been manning the music, quietly turned down the volume, though it had never been particularly loud. Isabella stood near the dessert table, her eyes wide, the paper plate in her hands trembling slightly. "The music is well within acceptable levels," Carlos responded, maintaining his composure. "And we've invited family and a few close friends to welcome us to our new home." "Well, I didn't say you could welcome anyone." Karen's voice rose higher. "This is exactly what we were worried about when they started selling to She didn't finish her sentence, but her meaning hung heavy in the air. Several of Carlos's guests shifted uncomfortably, all too familiar with what was really happening here. Pete stepped forward, still holding the grill tongs. "Ma'am, with all due respect, they own this home. They have every right to host their family." Karen pulled out her phone, holding it up like a weapon. "We'll see about that. I'm calling the police." "And the HOA. This is clearly a violation of something." A few other neighbors had emerged from their homes, drawn by Karen's loud complaints. They stood on their lawns, watching the scene unfold but not intervening. Some looked embarrassed, others curious, and a few seemed to be nodding in agreement with Karen. Carlos's young nephew started crying, and Elena quickly moved to comfort him. The happy atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by a tense silence broken only by Karen's loud voice as she made her phone call. "Yes, hello? Police? I need to report a disturbance," she was saying into her phone. "There's an unauthorized gathering at 487 Oak Grove Drive. They're being very loud and, yes, I'll hold." Carlos looked around at his family and friends. He saw the hurt in their eyes, the stiff way they held themselves, trying to maintain dignity in the face of such blatant prejudice. He thought about all the times in his life he'd faced moments like this, all the times he'd had to prove himself worthy of spaces others took for granted. But this was different. This was his home. The home he'd bought after decades of serving his country. The home where his children would grow up. He wasn't about to let anyone make his family feel unwelcome here. As Karen continued her dramatic phone conversation, Carlos quietly excused himself and walked toward the garage. Elena watched him go, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She knew her husband well enough to know he had a plan. The gathering had gone silent, guests speaking in whispers if at all. The only sounds were the sizzling of meat on the grill and Karen's voice as she now placed a second call, this one to the Homeowners Association. "Yes, this is Karen Thompson at 489 Oak Grove Drive," she was saying. "I need to report a serious violation of community standards. The new residents are having some kind of massive party and—" She never got to finish that sentence, because at that moment Carlos emerged from the garage, and what happened next would change everything in the Oak Grove neighborhood. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the uncomfortable silence that had settled over the backyard. 2 police cars turned onto Oak Grove Drive, their lights flashing but sirens now quiet. The kids huddled closer to their parents, while some of the adult guests started gathering their belongings, preparing for the worst. Elena watched as her beautiful family gathering crumbled around her. The food sat half-eaten on the tables, the music had long since been turned off, and the joyful atmosphere had vanished like morning mist under a hot sun. She caught sight of Isabella trying to comfort her younger cousins, who had never experienced anything like this before. Karen Thompson stood at her fence with a triumphant smile, phone still in hand as she now dialed another number. "Yes, hello, HOA emergency line. This is Karen Thompson, board member. We have a situation that requires immediate attention." The police cars pulled up in front of the house, and 2 officers stepped out. One was older, with gray starting to show at his temples, while the other looked fresh out of the academy. They surveyed the scene, the carefully decorated backyard, the family gathering, the food on the grill, with professional neutrality. Karen immediately rushed to meet them, her ponytail bouncing with each determined step. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. They're violating at least 3 neighborhood ordinances. The noise, the crowd, the cooking smells." Pete, who had been manning the grill in Carlos's absence, set down his tongs and straightened his back. Other veterans among the guests did the same, their military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. They'd formed a supple but supportive presence behind Elena as she stepped forward to speak with the officers. "Good afternoon, officers," Elena said calmly, her nurse's training helping her maintain her composure. "We're having a family BBQ to celebrate moving into our new home. Is there a problem?" The younger officer pulled out a notepad. "We received a complaint about noise and a possibly unauthorized gathering. How many people do you have here?" Before Elena could answer, Karen interrupted. "I counted at least 30 people. The HOA clearly states that any gathering of more than 15 people requires prior approval. And look at all these cars." She gestured dramatically toward the street where guests had carefully parked their vehicles. The older officer held up his hand, silencing Karen's tirade. "Ma'am, please let us handle this." He turned back to Elena. "Are you the homeowner?" "Yes, my husband and I bought this house last month." He's just stepped away for a moment. Elena gestured toward the garage where Carlos had disappeared. "Well, he better have permits for all this," Karen interjected again. "That grill setup looks completely unauthorized, and I'm sure they haven't submitted proper plans for all these modifications." She waved her hand dismissively at the beautiful stone patio and landscaping Carlos had worked so hard to create. Miguel, who had been watching everything from near the house, suddenly spoke up. "Mom, should I go get Dad?" Elena shook her head slightly. She knew Carlos would return when the time was right. Her husband had faced much worse situations during his career. He would know exactly how to handle this. The younger officer was walking the perimeter of the yard, measuring the noise level with a handheld device. "Actually," he reported, "the decibel levels are well within acceptable ranges for a weekend afternoon." Karen wasn't deterred. "Well, what about the food? They're clearly running some kind of unauthorized food service operation. Look at all this." She pointed to the spread of homemade dishes that covered the tables. Rosa, Elena's sister, stepped forward, her voice shaking with barely contained anger. "That's my mother's recipe for empanadas you're pointing at. This is a family gathering, not a restaurant." More neighbors had gathered on the street now, drawn by the police presence. Some looked embarrassed by the situation, while others whispered among themselves. A few had their phones out, recording everything. The older officer sighed, clearly recognizing the situation for what it was. He'd probably seen similar scenes play out before. "Ma'am," he addressed Karen, "having a family BBQ is not a crime. As for the HOA regulations—" "I've already contacted them," Karen cut in smugly. "The HOA president is on his way. We take these violations very seriously in Oak Grove." Elena felt her heart sink. They had reviewed the HOA guidelines carefully before buying the house, making sure their plans for family gatherings would be allowed. But she knew how these situations could go when someone in authority was determined to find a problem. The sound of another car approaching drew everyone's attention. A sleek black SUV pulled up, and a man in a polo shirt and khakis stepped out, carrying a folder stuffed with papers. Karen's face lit up with vindication. "Finally. Now you'll all see," she declared. "Mr. Richardson will straighten this out. He's been HOA president for 8 years, and he knows exactly how to handle people who don't respect our community standards." The tension in the backyard reached a breaking point. Some guests were already quietly saying their goodbyes to Elena, not wanting to cause more trouble. Isabella had tears in her eyes as she watched her carefully planned decorations flutter listlessly in the afternoon breeze. Miguel stood rigid, his teenage face struggling to hide his hurt and anger. But just as Mr. Richardson reached the gateway to the backyard, the door to the garage opened. All eyes turned to watch as Carlos stepped out, and what happened next would leave Karen Thompson speechless for the first time since she'd moved to Oak Grove 5 years ago. The HOA president stopped mid-stride, his folder of papers forgotten in his hands. The younger police officer's eyes widened in recognition, while his older partner quickly straightened his posture. Even the neighbors recording on their phones lowered their devices in surprise. Because Carlos Martinez was no longer wearing his Kiss the Cook apron, and his appearance was about to change everything about this situation. The garage door closed behind Carlos with a quiet click that somehow echoed through the tense silence. He stood there in his perfectly pressed Marine Corps dress blues, medals gleaming in the afternoon sun. The uniform fit him like it was tailored yesterday, his posture straight and commanding. But it was the silver eagle on his shoulders, the mark of a full colonel, that caught everyone's immediate attention. The younger police officer immediately snapped to attention, his hand rising in a crisp salute. "Colonel Martinez, sir." The older officer followed suit, his movement equally respectful but tinged with surprise. Carlos returned their salutes with practiced precision, then lowered his hand and smiled warmly. "At ease, officers. I appreciate you responding to our neighbors' concerns." His voice carried the same gentle tone he used earlier, but now it held an unmistakable note of authority. Karen Thompson's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The phone in her hand dropped to her side forgotten. Behind her, Mr. Richardson, the HOA president, had turned an interesting shade of pale. Pete, still standing by the grill, couldn't help but grin. He'd served under Carlos years ago and had been waiting for this moment since the police arrived. The other veterans in the crowd stood a little straighter, some fighting back smiles of their own. Carlos walked across the patio, his shoes clicking against the stones he laid with his own hands. He stopped in front of the officers, positioning himself between them and his family. "I believe there was some concern about our gathering?" he asked mildly. The older officer cleared his throat. "Sir, we received a complaint about noise levels and possible violations of HOA regulations. But we've already confirmed the noise is well within acceptable limits." "I see," Carlos nodded. "And the HOA regulations?" He turned to face Mr. Richardson, who was still clutching his folder of papers like a shield. The HOA president stepped forward, his previous confidence notably diminished. "Colonel, we had no idea. That is to say." He paused, took a breath, and tried again. "Mrs. Thompson expressed concerns about the number of guests and the modifications to your property." Carlos gestured to the backyard around them. The patio and landscaping were all done according to HOA specifications. "I personally submitted the plans last month, and they were approved by your office." He paused, then added with just a hint of steel in his voice, "I have copies of all the paperwork, if you'd like to review them." Mr. Richardson quickly shook his head. No, that won't be necessary, Colonel. I'm sure everything is in order." Isabella had moved closer to her mother, watching her father with shining eyes. She'd seen him in uniform before, but never quite like this. Miguel stood tall beside his sister, pride evident on his face as he watched their father handle the situation with such dignity. Karen, however, wasn't quite ready to give up. But the gathering size, she sputtered. "The HOA rules clearly state." Article 7, Section 3 of the HOA bylaws, Carlos interrupted smoothly, permits residential gatherings of up to 50 people for family events, provided proper parking considerations are maintained. He smiled. "Which is why we distributed parking maps to our guests and ensured no driveways were blocked." The younger officer couldn't hide his admiration. "Sir, if I may, my brother served under you at Camp Pendleton. He always said you were thorough in everything you did." Carlos's expression warmed. "Thank you, officer. Please give your brother my regards." He turned back to Karen and Mr. Richardson. "Now, about those other concerns." But Karen had finally noticed something that made her already pale face turn almost white. She was staring at the ribbon rack on Carlos's chest, particularly at one specific medal. Is that a Navy Cross?" The older officer answered for Carlos. "Yes, ma'am, it is. The Navy Cross is the second highest military decoration that can be awarded to a member of any branch of the United States military." Elena moved to stand beside her husband, slipping her hand into his. She knew the story behind that medal, a story Carlos rarely told, about a mission in Afghanistan where he'd risked his life to save not only his men, but also a village of civilians caught in the crossfire. The neighbors who had been recording on their phones were still filming, but their expressions had changed from nosy interest to something approaching awe. Even those who had been nodding along with Karen's complaints earlier now looked deeply embarrassed. Carlos cleared his throat. "I think we can all agree that this has been a simple misunderstanding. My family and I are simply trying to celebrate our new home with loved ones." He paused, looking directly at Karen. "In fact, as I mentioned earlier, you're welcome to join us. My father always said that good food has a way of turning neighbors into friends." Mr. Richardson quickly seized the opportunity to salvage the situation. "I believe everything is in order here. Mrs. Thompson, I think we can consider this matter closed." He turned to Carlos and Elena. "Colonel, Mrs. Martinez, on behalf of the Oak Grove HOA, please accept our apologies for any inconvenience." The police officers also prepared to leave, but not before the older one turned to Carlos. "Sir, thank you for your service, and welcome to the neighborhood." As the officials departed, the tension in the backyard began to dissipate. The music was turned back on, though softer than before. Kids slowly returned to playing, and conversations gradually resumed. Pete went back to checking the grill, though the knowing smile never left his face. Karen stood rooted to her spot, looking like she desperately wanted to disappear, but couldn't quite figure out how. Her phone, which had been her weapon of choice earlier, now hung limply at her side. Carlos approached her one last time, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Mrs. Thompson, I meant what I said about joining us. My wife makes an amazing tres leches cake, and I'd be happy to share my father's secret BBQ recipe with your family." With that, he turned back to his guests, removing his service cap and replacing it with his Kiss the Cook apron over his dress blues. As he walked back to the grill, Elena tucked herself under his arm, and their children rushed to hug him. The gathering slowly came back to life, but now there was a new story being shared among the guests, not just about a decorated Marine colonel who had stood up to prejudice with dignity and grace, but about a man who had responded to hostility with an invitation to break bread together. And as the afternoon sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the patio Carlos had built with his own hands, the smell of good food and the sound of laughter once again filled the air in the backyard of the Martinez family's new home. Just as the party was beginning to recover its festive atmosphere, a new car pulled into the neighborhood. The sleek military-issue vehicle caught everyone's attention as it parked near the Martinez home. A man in naval uniform stepped out, his face showing clear concern as he took in the scene. The police cars just leaving, the gathered neighbors, and his wife Karen still standing frozen by the fence. Lieutenant Thompson's eyes widened as he recognized Carlos in his dress blues. The blood drained from his face as the realization hit him. He had just rushed home because his wife had called him about trouble with the new neighbors, who turned out to be his new commanding officer. "Colonel Martinez, sir." Lieutenant Thompson snapped to attention as he approached, his salute crisp despite his obvious distress. He was newly assigned to the Naval Submarine Base New London, where he'd been looking forward to advancing his career. Now, thanks to his wife's actions, he feared that career might be in jeopardy. Carlos returned the salute with characteristic grace. "At ease, Lieutenant. I'm glad you could join us." His voice carried no hint of anger or reproach, though everyone in the yard held their breath, waiting to see how this would unfold. Karen's expression shifted from confusion to horror as she watched her husband interact with Carlos. She had spent the last hour trying to shut down this family gathering, only to discover she'd been attempting to harass the new commander of the entire submarine base, her husband's boss. Lieutenant Thompson turned to his wife, his voice barely above a whisper. "Karen, do you realize who they are? Colonel Martinez is taking command of the base next week. The whole base has been preparing for his arrival." The gathered neighbors watched as Karen's face cycled through various shades of red. The phone she used to make all those complaints suddenly felt very heavy in her hand. A few of the guests who'd overheard the exchange tried to hide their smiles behind their drinks. Elena, ever the gracious hostess, stepped forward to break the awkward tension. "Lieutenant Thompson, would you and your wife like some food? Everything's still warm, and Carlos just put fresh meat on the grill." Before either Thompson could respond, another car pulled up. This time, it was the base's current commander, Captain Richards, stepping out in his summer whites. He'd received word about the incident and had come personally to handle any potential fallout. "Colonel Martinez," Captain Richards called out as he approached. "I heard there might be some excitement at your new home." His eyes flickered briefly to Karen and Lieutenant Thompson before returning to Carlos. "I was hoping to wait until Monday to tell everyone, but since we're here," he smiled and turned to address the gathered crowd. For those who don't know, Colonel Martinez isn't just any Marine colonel. He's been selected as the new commander of Naval Submarine Base New London. His humanitarian work in disaster zones and his leadership in joint operations made him the Pentagon's top choice for the position. We're incredibly fortunate to have him and his family joining our community. The revelation rippled through the crowd. Neighbors who had been watching from a distance began to drift closer, their expressions shifting from curiosity to embarrassment to eagerness to make a better second impression. Isabella beamed with pride as she heard the captain praise her father. Miguel stood taller, though he'd known about his dad's new position for weeks. Elena squeezed Carlos's hand, remembering all the late nights and long deployments that had led to this moment. Karen looked like she wanted the ground to swallow her whole. Her earlier complaints about foreign smells and community standards now seemed even more obviously prejudiced and small-minded. She'd spent the afternoon trying to assert her authority as an HOA board member, only to discover she'd been attempting to bully the highest-ranking military officer in the region. Lieutenant Thompson, still standing at parade rest, addressed Carlos. "Sir, I cannot apologize enough for this situation. My wife and I." He glanced at Karen, who seemed to be fighting back tears. "We should have welcomed you properly to the neighborhood." Carlos raised his hand to stop the lieutenant's apology. "Today is about family and community, Lieutenant. Nothing more, nothing less." He looked around at the gathered crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "In the Marines, we learn quickly that diversity is our strength. Every unit I've commanded has been made stronger by its mix of backgrounds and experiences." Pete, who had known Carlos for years, nodded in agreement. He'd seen firsthand how Carlos's leadership style brought people together, how he could turn a diverse group of individuals into a cohesive team. Captain Richards smiled knowingly. That's exactly why he was chosen for this command. The base isn't just a military installation, it's part of this community. We needed someone who could bridge those gaps. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard as the truth of the situation settled over everyone. The neighbors who had been whispering and recording earlier now looked ashamed of their behavior. Some began to approach Alina, offering hesitant but genuine apologies and asking if they could bring anything to contribute to the gathering. Karen finally found her voice, though it quivered slightly. "Colonel Martinez, Mrs. Martinez, I don't know what to say. My behavior was coming from a place of misunderstanding." Carlos finished for her kindly. "And misunderstandings can be corrected over good food and conversation." He gestured to the laden tables. "Please join us, both of you." Lieutenant Thompson looked at his wife, then back at Carlos. "Sir, we couldn't possibly." "That's an order, Lieutenant," Carlos said with a gentle smile. "My father always said that the best way to learn about someone is to share a meal with them, and his BBQ recipe has a way of making even difficult conversations easier." As if to emphasize his point, the smell of grilling meat wafted through the air, reminding everyone why they had gathered in the first place. The tension began to dissolve as Carlos's graceful handling of the situation gave everyone a path forward. Isabella, showing wisdom beyond her years, approached Karen with a plate of her mother's tres leches cake. "Would you like to try some? My mom makes it from my grandmother's recipe." That simple gesture from a child seemed to break the last of the ice. Karen accepted the plate with trembling hands and a genuine thank you, possibly her first kind words of the day. The gathering gradually transformed into something more than just a family BBQ. It became a moment of community transformation, where prejudices began to melt away under the warmth of shared food and genuine conversation. And at the center of it all stood Carlos Martinez, not just as a decorated Marine colonel or the new base commander, but as a man who knew that the best way to change hearts was to first fill stomachs and open minds. The change in Oak Grove didn't happen all at once, but it started that very evening as the sun began to set over the Martinez family's BBQ. One by one, neighbors who had been watching from afar began approaching the yard, drawn by the mouth-watering aromas and the sound of genuine laughter. Mrs. Chen from 2 houses down was the first to arrive, carrying a plate of her homemade spring rolls. "I've been wanting to come over since you moved in," she admitted to Elena, "but I wasn't sure if it would be welcome." She glanced apologetically at Karen, who was still trying to process the afternoon's events. Shortly after, the Rodriguez family from across the street appeared with their famous guacamole. Mr. Rodriguez, a retired high school teacher, had tears in his eyes as he shook Carlos's hand. "We've lived here for 15 years, he said quietly. "This is the first time we felt truly part of the community." The Baker family brought their children, who quickly joined Isabella and Miguel in a game of soccer in the side yard. The sound of children laughing together created a soundtrack of hope for the future of Oak Grove. Mrs. Baker, who served on the HOA board with Karen, looked around the beautifully maintained yard with new eyes. "Colonel Martinez," she said, "would you consider joining our landscaping committee? Your design skills are remarkable." Pete, still manning the grill alongside Carlos, couldn't help but chuckle at how quickly things had changed. "Just like old times, sir," he said quietly. "You always knew how to bring a unit together." The transformation was most visible in Karen Thompson. Gone was the righteous indignation of earlier, replaced by quiet reflection as she watched the community come together. Her husband, Lieutenant Thompson, had relaxed slightly after Carlos assured him that the afternoon's events would have no bearing on his career. The measure of a person, Carlos had told him, isn't in never making mistakes. It's in how we learn from them. As the evening progressed, more stories began to emerge. Mrs. Chen shared how she'd often felt invisible in neighborhood meetings. The Rodriguez family spoke about the subtle ways they'd been made to feel like outsiders. Even the Patel kids, who'd lived in Oak Grove their whole lives, admitted they'd never felt comfortable having their friends over for traditional Indian celebrations. Karen listened to these stories with growing understanding, her hand gripping her husband's tightly. The weight of her actions, not just today, but over the years as an HOA board member, seemed to settle on her shoulders. Elena noticed Karen's distress and did something remarkable. She asked for her help. "Karen, would you mind showing me how the HOA filing system works? I'd love to get involved, maybe help organize some community events." The simple act of inclusion, especially from someone she'd tried to exclude just hours ago, brought fresh tears to Karen's eyes. But these were different tears than before. "I'd like that," she managed to say. "And maybe we could review some of the old guidelines. Update them to better reflect our community." Mr. Richardson, the HOA president who had left earlier in embarrassment, returned with his family and a large tray of desserts. "Colonel," he said, approaching Carlos, "I've been thinking. We've never had a community cultural festival in Oak Grove. Would you and Elena consider helping us organize one?" Carlos smiled. "Only if everyone gets to share their family recipes. My father always said that food is the fastest way to understand someone's story." The idea caught fire quickly. Mrs. Chen offered to teach a dumpling-making class. Mrs. Rodriguez volunteered her church's space for larger gatherings. The Patel family suggested combining the festival with Diwali celebrations, promising to show everyone how to light traditional lamps. As darkness fell, Carlos and Pate fired up the strings of lights Isabella had harmelia. The soft glow illuminated a scene that would have seemed impossible just hours ago: children of different backgrounds playing together, adults engaged in genuine conversation, and plates of food from various cultures being shared and appreciated. Lieutenant Thompson, watching it all, shook his head in amazement. "Sir," he said to Carlos, "I think you've accomplished more community relations in one afternoon than we've managed in years." Carlos's response was typically modest. Sometimes people just need permission to be their better selves. He looked around at the gathered neighbors. "And sometimes it takes a little confrontation to realize we all want the same things: a safe community, good friends, and a place to call home." The evening wound down naturally, with neighbors exchanging phone numbers and making plans for future get-togethers. The kids were reluctant to say goodbye to their new friends, and several parents had to promise playdates before they could convince them to leave. Mrs. Baker, on her way out, stopped to speak with Carlos and Elena. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "we've had this idea of maintaining community standards for so long, we forgot what community actually means. Thank you for reminding us." Karen and Lieutenant Thompson were among the last to leave. Karen had spent the evening quietly helping Elena clean up, her actions speaking louder than any words of apology. As they prepared to go, she turned to the Martinez family. "I know I don't deserve it," she said softly, "but thank you for not giving up on me today." Carlos's response was to hand her a container of leftover BBQ. "This is my father's recipe," he said. "Maybe next weekend you can try making it yourself. We'll be happy to taste test it for you." As the last guests departed, the Martinez family stood in their backyard, taking in the quiet of the evening. The tables were cleared, the lights still twinkled, and the air held the lingering scent of good food and better conversations. Isabella hugged her father tightly. "Dad, is it always going to be like this now?" Carlos looked at his family. Elena's proud smile, Miguel's relaxed posture, Isabella's hopeful eyes. "Change takes time, mi amor," he said honestly. "But today, we all took the first step together. And in my experience, that's always the most important one." The story of the Martinez family's BBQ spread quickly through the military community and the neighborhood. But it wasn't just a story about confronting prejudice or revealing hidden identities. It became a story about how one afternoon could begin to transform a community, how good food and open hearts could bridge divides that had seemed uncrossable, and how sometimes the best way to change minds was simply to offer someone a plate of food and a chance to be better. 6 months after the infamous BBQ incident, Oak Grove had become a different place. The story of that summer afternoon had spread throughout the military community and beyond, becoming something of a legend at the Naval Submarine Base. But the real changes were happening quietly in the day-to-day life of the neighborhood. The Martinez family's monthly BBQs had become a community tradition. Each gathering brought new faces, new dishes, and new stories. The once pristine but sterile neighborhood had transformed into a vibrant tapestry of cultures and connections. On this particular Sunday, Carlos stood at his grill, now expanded into an impressive outdoor kitchen thanks to a community effort, and watched as children played basketball in his driveway. Among them was Miguel, teaching some younger kids the proper shooting technique. The sound of their laughter mixed with the sizzle of meat and the chatter of conversations in multiple languages. Elena worked alongside Mrs. Chen, learning the secret to perfect dumpling plates while sharing her own tips for empanada filling. The two women had become close friends, often exchanging recipes and life stories over coffee. Their friendship had inspired others to reach across the cultural divides that had once seemed so insurmountable. Isabella, now confident in her place in the community, had started a neighborhood youth council. Their first project, a community garden where families could grow vegetables and herbs from their native countries. The once empty lot at the end of the street now bloomed with everything from Italian tomatoes to Thai basil. Colonel Martinez called out Mr. Rodriguez, approaching the grill with a plate of his grilled corn. "You won't believe what happened at the HOA meeting yesterday." Carlos smiled, knowing that the HOA had undergone its own transformation. Under new leadership, a diverse council that included Mrs. Chen and Elena, the association had shifted its focus from enforcing rigid standards to building a stronger community. That unanimously approved our proposal for the International Food Festival, Mr. Rodriguez continued excitedly. And guess who volunteered to head the organizing committee? Before Carlos could answer, Karen Thompson appeared with a stack of paper plates. She'd changed over the past months, her designer yoga pants and superior attitude replaced by genuine warmth and a willingness to learn. The woman who had once called the police on a family BBQ was now one of the strongest advocates for community inclusion. "I hope you don't mind," Karen said, a hint of her old uncertainty showing through. "I thought, given how everything started," she trailed off, still occasionally struggling with the memory of that day. "It's perfect," Carlos assured her. Lieutenant Thompson, standing nearby, beamed with pride at his wife's transformation. His own career had flourished under Carlos' command, but more importantly, he and Karen had found true friendship within the community they'd once sought to exclude. The success of Oak Grove's transformation hadn't gone unnoticed. Other military communities had reached out, asking Carlos to share his experience. He always told them the same thing. Change happens one meal at a time, one conversation at a time, one person at a time. Pete, who still came to every BBQ, often joked that Carlos had achieved more community integration with his father's BBQ recipe than most diversity programs managed with years of formal training. But everyone knew it wasn't just about the food. It was about creating spaces where people could be their authentic selves. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, Elena called everyone to attention. The community had gathered for more than just their usual monthly BBQ. Today, they were celebrating the official launch of the Oak Grove Community Integration Program, an initiative that would help other neighborhoods learn from their experience. Carlos watched as his wife addressed the crowd, her confidence having grown along with the community. "When we moved here," Elena said, "we hoped to find a home. Instead, we found something better. We found a family, and family means everyone belongs." The crowd applauded, and Carlos noticed tears in more than a few eyes. The Patel children were teaching other kids how to play cricket in the side yard. Mrs. Baker and Mrs. Rodriguez were exchanging recipes. Even the newest residents, a young couple who'd moved in last week, were already being drawn into conversations and made to feel welcome. Isabella tugged at her father's sleeve. "Dad, remember when you said change takes time?" She gestured at the gathered crowd. I think we did it pretty fast. Carlos hugged his daughter close. The fast changes are the ones you can see, mi amor. But the real changes, the ones in people's hearts, those are still happening every day. As if to prove his point, Karen stepped up to the microphone after Elena. Her hands shook slightly, but her voice was clear. A year ago, I thought I knew what made a good community. I thought it was about rules and standards and keeping things the way they'd always been. I was wrong. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Real community is about making room for everyone's story. It's about learning that different doesn't mean wrong. And sometimes, she smiled at Carlos and Elena, it's about having the courage to try someone else's food and listen to someone else's story. The base commander, who'd come to support the program launch, nodded in approval. Under Carlos's leadership, the connection between the military base and the local community had strengthened considerably. The success in Oak Grove had become a model for other military installations across the country. As the evening wound down, Carlos found himself sitting on his patio, surrounded by the community he'd helped build. The string lights twinkled overhead, the same ones from that first contentious BBQ, but now they illuminated a very different scene. Miguel was teaching Lieutenant Thompson's son how to play guitar. Mrs. Chen was showing Isabella how to write Chinese characters. Karen and Elena were planning next month's community newsletter. The once rigid boundaries between neighbors had melted away, replaced by genuine connections. Pete sat down next to Carlos, handing him a plate of food that represented at least 4 different culinary traditions. "You know what's funny, sir?" he said. That day, when Karen called the police, she thought she was protecting her community. She just didn't understand what community really meant. Carlos nodded, watching as another new family was warmly welcomed into the gathering. Sometimes people build walls because they've never experienced the joy of building bridges. The story of Oak Grove's transformation had started with a confrontation over a family BBQ, but it had grown into something much more significant. It had become a testament to the power of sharing food, sharing stories, and sharing lives. It proved that sometimes the strongest communities are built not by maintaining barriers, but by having the courage to break them down, one plate of food at a time. And as for Karen Thompson, she still lived in Oak Grove, but now she was known for something very different, her monthly cooking classes where she taught her neighbors how to make Colonel Martinez's famous BBQ sauce, along with a healthy serving of humble pie.